So now we need to talk about, well, we use different terms for the directions in anatomy. We also use different terms for the cuts that we make in our specimens, or we use these words to describe the way the specimen was cut for us. It just depends on what we're going to be using in the lab. This happens to be a section, so it's a cut portion from a human brain. It's an image of cut portion of a human brain. You can kind of get an idea of the size. This is about 3.5 centimeters from here to here. And we know that the whole brain isn't here. This is just one little section of it. So when you hear the word section in anatomy, think of a cut has been made. Some type of a slice has been made. And it could be a thick section, it could be a really thin section, but the direction of which you make that cut has different names according to how the cut is made. So this cut is known as a coronal section or a frontal section because it's made from a brain that came out of somebody's head, and we basically took a knife and sliced it this way from left to right twice. So we basically have about maybe an inch thick brain matter there. But then brains can also be cut right in the center, up and down, like this. We call this a mid-sagittal section, and it would give you that half brain look that we're looking at right here. This is another frontal section, or another name is coronal section. But then there's another type of cut or a section that we make, which is known as the transverse section, and this would be a cut this way. Actually, I'm going to take this background off because it's going to make my hand movements really hard for you to see. Sorry, Minecraft lovers out there. So we have the frontal section, which could be the up and down cut of a specimen in an anatomical position. We have the mid-sagittal section, which would create that left and right of your specimen. And then we have a transverse section, which would basically create a top and bottom. It goes like that. And that would be the bottom section of a transverse plane or a section. So please write the letter B, period, and write the words planes and sections. Oh, I did not want to do that because I don't want to give you all the information at once. Planes and sections, there we go. The first type of section, or the first type of cut, is known as a sagittal section. And if we were in class, when we come across these vocab words, I would usually have you all repeat them after me. I'm not going to expect you to do that at home. I know you may have, other things going on in your house. If you have quiet and you're okay repeating after me, that's a really good idea because it will help you learn the vocabulary better. Not only does helping sound out words, you'll learn how to sound out the word, but by doing that, by speaking the word, it actually helps your brain create a connection so that you'll remember it better. So please repeat after me, sagittal section. And now a sagittal section divides the body into a left and a right portion, or it divides the specimen into a left and a right portion. But it's an unequal left and right portion. So a sagittal cut, if we were thinking about a brain, would be a cut that basically goes in this direction, but it's not quite in the center. It's a little bit off to the side. So we would have a small right piece of brain and then a big left piece of brain. But now if you did that same type of cut, a sagittal section right in the middle, and it divides it into an equal left and an equal right, that is known as a mid-sagittal section. So please repeat that after me, mid-sagittal section. Thank you. Well, that works too. So the mid-sagittal section is right in the center, the middle or the midline. And it is a section that is like this. It creates an equal left and equal right. It may be opposite through the camera, I can't tell. A sagittal section, it's the same type of cut, but it's not in the middle. It's not in the center. And you may have a bigger side over here than over here after that cut's made. Imagine a big blade going through my head. And those of you that don't like me may want to imagine that more, or whatever. A blade going through my head and it's basically leaving a left and a right that would then fall apart. That's a sagittal section. If it's in the middle, it's a mid-sagittal section. If there were a equal left and right Mr. Gorgoni piece flopping to the sides, that would be a mid-sagittal section. But then if you made a different type of cut, let's say there's a big blade coming down from the wall in this direction. We call that a frontal section. And it literally creates a front that would separate from the back. So you see a blade coming from the side all the way down in this direction, and then the front of the face would fall forward, the back would fall that way. That is known as a frontal section. It divides the body into front and back portions. And remember, when I'm talking about body, I mean, I'm not trying to give you gruesome images in your mind. We also are referring to organs. We're referring to, you know, other types of specimens that we would then need to slice in that direction. So you may be looking at a heart in class, and it actually, I have you make a frontal section with that heart. So I'll have you orient the heart in a particular way, and I'll tell you to make a frontal section through that heart. And if you don't make that section correct, you're not going to have the correct insides when you open it up. You're going to want to have a clear front and a clear back from each other. So when that instruction is given, you want to make sure you know what I'm talking about. If I say make a frontal section, that's dividing the front and the back into two pieces. A mid-sagittal section creates a left and a right of equal sides. A sagittal section creates a left and the right. It's just not equal.
So wait, the cut would go completely down the middle of the heart, but sideways? Yeah,
so for the heart dissection that we're going to do, you're going to need to make a slice all the way through basically the center of it to create a front and a back that you open up. I'll show you how to do it when we're in class. This is towards second semester, so I'm pretty sure we'll have class time at that point. And don't worry about it now. I'm just trying to give an example. The frontal section creates a front and then a back from your specimen. I like to think of it just if you were slicing a body. You know, it gives you a little bit more of a visual image to what I'm trying to describe. Then there's the transverse section. Transverse divides the body into an upper and a lower portion. So please repeat after me, transverse section. And I'm going to give you an example of all of these so that you can get kind of an idea of what I'm trying to describe. And I know through this video, it's really hard for me to use my hands to show you what I mean. And you may be confused right now. I get that. So just try to hang in there. You'll have plenty of time to practice this stuff too. Going to be giving you guys samurai swords to take home, and you're going to get to practice that. I'm joking. I'm not sending you samurai swords. Sorry. I don't even have a samurai sword. Okay, so let's look at some examples here. Let me get my little diagram. See if I can find it. I have it here. Shoot, let me look for it. There we go, good. Okay, so here's an anatomical image, or here's an image of someone in the anatomical position. Anatomical image means just that we're looking at an image in the anatomical position. That is a scary thought, Jason. Please be careful. And I was joking, of course. Please don't use it, like I said. All right, so sagittal section. Sagittal section is this plane right here, the letter B. So notice how it is next to this other plane, letter A, but letter A happens to be in the center, right down the midline of that body. So if letter B is a sagittal section, guys, what is letter A? What type of cut would that be?
A medium one, or is that the correct?
The middle one, yes. What do we call that one? Good, Kim. Anybody else? Anybody can answer.
The mid-sagittal section?
Kim says mid-sagittal section. Any otherybody want to jump in? If letter B is a sagittal section, letter A is in the mid line. It's in the middle, so that would definitely be a mid-sagittal section. Thank you, Liliana. And so letter B is the sagittal section. Letter A is the mid-sagittal section, or a plane. That's why we say planes and sections. We could be looking at a specimen that's already been cut, and we're looking at a particular plane. So we say it's in the mid-sagittal. It was open from the mid-sagittal plane. So sometimes we use the word section, sometimes we use the word plane. And a plane is just a three-dimensional, it's like a three-dimensional line. Okay, now, when we create a front and back portion, we create, like I said, it's a cut that would go down like this. You'd have a front, you would have a back. Can anybody tell me what letter D or C is the section that would create a front or back? Scarlett says C. Anybody else? Ramiro says D. Will says D. What is that section called? Joseph says D, Antonio says, I'm sorry, Joseph says C, Antonio says D, Liliana says C. What would that type of section or cut be called that creates a front and a back? Liliana also says C. Liliana says frontal section. Gloria says transverse section. What do we think? Let's get some more ideas up there. Scarlett says frontal section. Remember, we're going to be getting a front and a back. Will says frontal section. Scarlett says frontal. Antonio says frontal. Good. So it's definitely the frontal section. And if it's the frontal section, the only plane that would create that type of a cut would be letter C. Remember, front and back is created by the frontal section. So letter C, if you took a big blade and chopped down that body through the letters in that letter C plane, then you would have a distinct front and you would have a distinct back. So that's the frontal section. And then we're left with letter D. What type of section is letter D? It creates an upper and a lower portion. So Scarlett says transverse. Gloria says transverse. Liliana says transverse section. So we can look down here. Let's check. Divides the body into upper and lower portions. That would be the transverse section. Well, look at letter D. It actually probably already divided this, so we only have an upper section. But if that was a whole body, there would be a lower section. There'd be an upper section. Thank you, Joseph. Transverse. Good. So letter D would be a transverse section. Let's look at this another way. So here's all the different ways that you can cut. Here's the different planes again. Now here's an actual person's image in the anatomical position. You can see the sagittal plane is off to the side of that mid-sagittal plane, but they're both parallel. So sagittal and mid-sagittal are always going to be parallel. And sometimes you may make a mid-sagittal section in a specimen, and then you'll make a sagittal section in that other piece, because you just want a little strip to look at. And you may want to look at it from both sides to see what's inside. Then you have that frontal section. It's also known as a coronal section or a coronal plane, simply because of the fact that if you were looking at somebody's head, you would almost see like a corona around it. If you had that plane covering the head, almost like a halo, it would create a corona. So that's the frontal section. And then the last one, that's the transverse. And it is horizontal. So sometimes we just use the word horizontal plane. So transverse and horizontal mean the same thing. It's basically chopping this person in half, top to bottom. And I've probably seen too many horror flicks or action movies, whatever, where people have swords and they actually slice in a particular direction. So the way that I remember these are just basically thinking them almost like if a sword was to slice in a particular direction. That would create, if you had a sword slicing in the transverse direction, it would cut that person in a top and a bottom. If you cut the person right down in the middle, the center, that's a mid-sagittal section. The left and right would separate. If the slice was a little bit off center, it would create just a sagittal section where you had one bigger piece and then one smaller piece falling apart. And then of course the coronal section, you have that sword coming straight down and creating the front and the back. So I don't know if that helps you guys. That's kind of how I visualize it a little bit, and it helps me remember exactly what direction those slices are going to be coming in. And in fact, we won't be using swords, we'll be using scalpels, or a little bit smaller, but it's the same idea. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about here, and we're coming back now to the human body, are these really important areas of the human body, which are basically available for things to fill them. We call them cavities. Now, it's not the same cavity that you may have heard of before, having to do with teeth. I've had cavities before. They're expensive, they're painful, they really suck. You may have had cavities before where you had to go to the dentist. Hopefully you haven't. Hopefully you don't need to go to the dentist at some point for cavities. But nonetheless, that is a different type of cavity from what we are talking about in the human body, in anatomy. It's the same idea. The tooth cavity gets its name from the idea that it's creating a hole in the tooth. It's creating an opening in the tooth. But there's some major openings in the body that contain organs and hold the organs in place. And these are these different cavities of the body. And they're really important because if we didn't have these cavities, our organs would move around in our abdomen, and they could get in spots that would make them impossible to do their job. But you can see we have up here, this is the posterior aspect. Remember that word posterior refers to the back. And in the back, we have this basically two parts of a major cavity, which is known as the cranial cavity. It also extends down into the spinal cavity. The cranial cavity is the space that holds our brain. The cranium is another word for brain. And then the spinal cavity holds our spinal cord. And they are connected, which allows the brain to exchange fluid and nutrients with the spinal cord. But they're sealed off from everything else. And so we call that a cavity. Moving more towards the anterior portion of the body, or the ventral side of the body, we have the thoracic cavity, which holds our lungs in place, it holds our heart in place, and it holds a few other organs up here in place, like our thymus. Underneath that, but still towards the anterior ventral part of our body, the front, we have the abdominal cavity. And the abdominal cavity holds our liver, stomach, pancreas, spleen, small intestine, large intestine, and a few other smaller things like the kidneys. And it keeps all of those organs in place. And they're actually all held in place, which we'll talk about later when we get to connective tissues. Underneath the abdominal cavity, we have the pelvic cavity. This holds all of our reproductive organs. And they're sealed off from each other. The abdominal cavity has a little membrane that doesn't allow any of the abdomen, like the small intestine or large intestines, into the pelvic cavity, which has our reproductive organs. And that's important because our small intestines are moving around inside of our body. Our large intestine is moving around inside of our body, and we don't want it moving around into other areas where it could cause problems. Now, sometimes this little material, this tissue, gets a hole in it, and that happens from straining. Maybe you're trying to lift something too hard, or you're bearing down too hard, and you can actually create little tears in the membrane here, and we call that a hernia. And that hernia can allow some of your organs then to push into the pelvic cavity, which can cause pain and can cause some other issues, very serious issues if you leave it too long. But we'll get to that towards the end of our discussion of the tissues and connective tissues. What I want you to know are the differences between the cavities. So let's take a few notes. Next, please write the letter C. And then please write the word cavities. Number one, the first cavities are the dorsal cavity. Remember the words for the directions of back: posterior or dorsal, anterior or ventral. So the dorsal cavity is found towards the back of the body, towards the posterior area of the body. What was C? C. Letter C is just the letter that for this particular note? Is that what you're asking, Will? Do you see the notes up here? So in the dorsal cavity, there are some smaller cavities, one of which is the one at the top. It holds our brain. It's the cranial cavity. And I don't need you to remember what's inside the cavities. That was just for information purposes. I just need you to know where the cavities are. Also in that back cavity is the spinal cavity. So the dorsal cavity has two smaller cavities known as the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. Remember, the cranial cavity holds the brain, spinal cavity holds the spinal cord. And then number two, the ventral cavity. So Will, that's just the heading of the notes. We're talking about cavities. We're talking about spaces in the body. That's why that's there. And it's, the last section was letter B, the section before that was letter A. That's why it's C. Now, ventral is anterior. So it's anterior, towards the front. So the ventral cavity is the cavity towards the front. And that has three smaller cavities in it. First one is the thoracic cavity. That's the cavity up here. And the thoracic cavity is broken down into smaller cavities, but we're not going to worry about those. Underneath the thoracic cavity is the abdominal cavity. So that is this cavity. And then the last cavity that I want you to remember is the last part of the ventral cavity, which is below the abdominal cavity. It's known as the pelvic cavity. And this holds our reproductive organs. It also holds our bladder. Your very end of your large intestine is also in your pelvic cavity. Your rectum, your anus is in your pelvic cavity. All those things are really close. But remember, the cavities are openings in the body that hold organs. They provide space for the organs to be in one area, and it keeps them in that area. So they're very important, and they are usually sealed off from each other. I can't move that, that's right. Notice there's underlining here, there's underlining here, underlining here, underlining here, 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 and here. Make sure you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 questions just for this little section for cavities. And if you're not sure if something was underlined or not, these slide decks are always posted. You just go to the class resources and look for the day that you need. When we finish a whole chapter, I'll put all those slides up as a separate chapter deck. And actually, I believe we're at the end of this, so I'll probably do that this weekend for you. And I've been posting a version of the video that for lecture in case you miss it. Those can also be found in the class resources page. So the cavities. Towards the posterior direction, we have the dorsal cavity, we call it. It's broken down into the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. Towards the anterior, we have the ventral cavity, which is the thoracic cavity up here, the abdominal cavity here, and then the pelvic cavity here. We're done with notes, okay? This is just going to be a little bit of a review. So it's review time. Let me type this in there. So remember the directions. We have superior, inferior, anterior, posterior, medial, lateral, and proximal. When something is towards the bottom of the body in anatomical position, what word do we use? Towards the bottom. Well, remember, I wasn't referring to arm or leg. I'm just saying towards the bottom. But yes, Liliana, technically, if I was referring to the legs themselves, you would be correct. Will, try to put that whole word in there. We're not texting here. No worries. Will says inferior. Any other thoughts? Scarlett agrees, and I agree with you both. Inferior. Thank you, Liliana. Now, what about if something is towards the middle of the body? What is the word for that? Towards the middle. Scarlett says medial. Gloria says medial. Thank you. I would agree with that. That is the medial direction. Thank you, Liliana. Now, what about, oops, we're missing a word there, aren't we? There it is. So what about if something is found towards the very end of a limb, furthest way on a limb? What do we call it? What's the direction? Something like a hand or a foot on that limb. Liliana says lateral. Any other thoughts? So let's say the direction that I would say that my hand is on that arm, or my foot, would be the most what point? So when we're talking about arms and legs, look in your notes, guys. Only when we're talking about arms and legs would we use this term. When it's the furthest away from the attachment point. That's okay. Abigail says distal. I would agree with that. So does Gloria. Good. So when something is furthest away on an arm, thank you, Joseph, we're saying that it's distal. When something is really close to that connection point, it's proximal. So proximal, distal. Proximal, distal. Okay, so then we have the ways to cut. We've kind of gone over these, so it's just a little reminder. The mid-sagittal is right in the center. Sagittal is off to the side. Frontal like that, up down cut, and then transverse like this, forward back. And then of course these cavities. There's the cranial cavity, which is part of the dorsal cavity because it's towards the back. Then the spinal cavity is also towards the back. The ventral cavity has the thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic cavity inside of it. This is just here to show you what I expect for you to remember. These are the terms that you have to memorize.